Good evening. I'd like to call the Planning Commission meeting for December 10th, 2019 to order. Can we begin with a roll call, please?
Chair Tagney.
Here.
Vice Chair Mayer.
Here.
Commissioner Reinman.
Here.
Commissioner Barstow.
Here.
Commissioner Vasade-Elcock.
Here.
And Commissioner White.
Here.
Thank you. And we are joined this evening at the staff table by Community Development Director David Loya, Senior Planner Joe Mateer, Senior Planner Dilo Freitas, and Deputy Director Jennifer Dart. The meeting is now open to oral communications from the public for items not on the agenda. Any items that require action may be set for an agenda at a later date. If anyone would like to address the Commission on items not in the agenda, now's your opportunity. Seeing none, we will move on to the consent calendar. And on this evening's consent calendar, we have approval of two sets of minutes, both from October 22nd, 2019 and November 12th, 2019. Do we have any discussion or a motion?
I'll move to accept the consent calendar.
I'll second that.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
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 Motion carries, unanimous. And now we can move on to our first public hearing of the evening, which is to review and comment on a draft environmental impact report for the Arcata Community Health Center Plan Development Permit and Design Review Permit. Staff report.
Good evening. My name is Joe Mateer, assigned planner for this particular project. The Planning Commission was introduced to this project on November 12th, where we reviewed some items, but the draft environmental impact report hadn't been circulated yet, so that tonight is your first night to view that during that circulation period. Staff is recommending the Planning Commission review and comment on the draft environmental impact report, provide direction to staff on the preparation of the final environmental impact report, and then any other recommendations to the City Council. I'll just refresh the commissioners on the project. The item would be reviewed and approved by the City Council. So it includes a plan development permit and then the adoption of the environmental impact report. Also, there's a development agreement that is associated with a portion of this project. On November 12th, the Planning Commission was provided in their packet project plans as Attachment A, and also the applicant's project description was Attachment B. The initial study that was drafted to support the draft environmental impact report was Attachment C, and then a D was the notice of preparation for the environmental impact report, and staff provided draft findings and conditions of approval with Attachment E of the November 12th staff report. Those are part of the administrative record, and we do encourage you to maintain those throughout the hearing process. Tonight's staff report included two attachments: the draft environmental impact report, which is Attachment F, and then the Wetland Mitigation and Monitoring report as Attachment G. The site is located between Sunset and Foster Avenue. It's a 1.8 acre parcel that is currently vacant near the roundabout by the skate park there with EYE Street and Sunset and Foster. The proposal is to develop a community health center, about 31,000 square feet on the 1.8 acre parcel. It's a split level, 2-story. Some portions of the structure is one level. There is a small area down below that will just house the mechanical equipment, kind of in the basement area. And I have the site plan. Here. The project would include parking. They're close to 79. They're right in the range between the minimum parking required and the maximum parking required. There'll be an entrance off of Foster Avenue with a drop-off area towards the plaza and the entrance to the main building, with exiting only on this section here. There is a small parking lot and area up here. This is where the generator is going to be located, and some of the solid waste recycling and organic materials will be there as well. So limited parking and access from Sunset. Mainly, the clients and staff will be utilizing the Foster area here. There are 2 isolated wetlands that are associated with the project, and they will be permanently impacted by the development. They're generally located in this area here. And so the draft environmental impact report does identify a mitigation plan to create wetlands at Shea Park on city property within the same watershed of Jolly Giant Creek. And it's going to be developed at a 2-to-1 ratio, and it would include a 20% buffer area or transition area. So overall, it does increase the size of the wetland. We believe definitely the staff supports the project. It would enhance the kind of the riparian and wetland already existing on the Shea Park area, some of the riparian area of Jolly Giant Creek. The applicant, I don't know if the botanist is here. No, okay. But Claire Brown produced the wetland delineation and the mitigation and monitoring plan for that wetland impact, and has been working closely with the City of Arcata staff as well as the Army Corps of Engineers and the Water Board, the North Coast Water Quality Regional Board. And they are going to be permit requirements from those 2 entities as well as City of Arcata review. The wetland mitigation would have a 5-year monitoring plan. It includes the removal of invasive species and then replanting with complementary plants that are already in that area and creating kind of a habitat area. So that report is attachment G. The other item that was identified through the initial study of a potential impact was traffic. And there was 2 studies that were done. One was based on a level of service, and that's one metric that jurisdictions use for transportation impacts, and the other one is vehicle miles traveled. And the state of California did recently change some of those standards within the CEQA guidelines. And the vehicle miles traveled will be the new threshold beginning in July of 2020. So the City of Arcata is working with other regional jurisdictions to try to create standards and thresholds that could uniquely be used throughout this region instead of having each separate jurisdiction have their own set of standards. So we'll be working with Humboldt County HCOG governments with the regional transportation plan for that study. But in the meantime, the traffic study that was prepared for the central Arcata area did identify that the Open Door Clinic, as well as several other housing projects in that area, would potentially create a transportation impact. And they recommended some mitigation measures. They looked at the travel management strategies throughout the city, including bicycle, pedestrians, public transportation, as well as the single occupancy vehicles. That would be the main impact would be transportation by the single occupancy vehicles. And so those are one of the things that we really want to try to do a paradigm shift and correct throughout the world. So just not here. Let's work on it everywhere. But anyway, right now we have this particular project. The traffic study did identify several areas to enhance transportation or minimize transportation impacts. And this project incorporates all of those. One of those would be a sidewalk continuation around this apex here of Sunset, and then along Foster, because right now there are no sidewalks there. Then also a connectivity between this area here on Sunset through either along this section here to Foster, or else there's a possibility of actually accessible access through the property to this sidewalk here. So you could go from there without having to walk all the way around. Over here, over by the skate park, there will be some bus stop being developed, and that was designed by the engineers from the Open Door Clinic's, their support team. There will be also that would service westbound bus service, and then also just beyond this roundabout would be additional bus stop for the eastbound service. And then potentially, one of the recommendations was a crosswalk. In review with the city engineer and the Transportation Safety Committee, the number of crosswalks on Foster is somewhat of a concern. Right now, there's several crosswalks, but they're further west of the site. And so would the project, I think that's something that the city is evaluating. Do we want another crosswalk here? Do we remove one of the existing crosswalks and relocate it here? But once there's too many crosswalks, it becomes it's minimized. Basically, when people are in a motor vehicle and they travel along, they kind of start ignoring those crosswalks. There's almost too many of them. So I think that's one of the concerns. And unfortunately, the city engineer isn't here tonight, but I would be happy to forward any of the comments from the public or the Planning Commission to the city engineer to respond to that. What they did with the traffic study was create a proportional relationship based on each project's contribution to that impact to the various intersections. And so the staff report does identify the proportional share that the Open Door Clinic would be responsible for, and that would be through the development agreement. Right now, the development agreement would only pertain to those traffic impact fees. Basically, the city of Arcata currently does not have a traffic mitigation impact program, and so the development agreement is one mechanism that we can do to collect those, to help assist with the eventual improvements to those intersections at LK Wood and Sunset, and then also Alliance and Foster were the main ones they're going to be working on. Other than that, let me see. The circulation period for the draft environmental impact report is it's a 45-day review period. It began on November 26th and will end on January 13th. Staff will be conducting one more hearing before the Planning Commission. That will be a separate noticed public hearing, and we anticipate that to be January 28th. At that January 28th meeting, we would have a full resolution for you, and we would have the draft final impact report prepared for you for your recommendation to the City Council that will take later action in February. Other than that, I know that the applicant, the architect, is here. I'm not sure if the engineer is here as well as the project manager and the chief officer of the Open Door Clinic to answer any questions you may have. And of course, staff is available for any questions you may have as well. Again, staff recommends that we obtain some comments on the draft environmental impact report. Also on the project, I did want to mention, sorry, I forgot, that at the last hearing, there were several comments about the finishes on the structure itself. Some of the commissioners were questioning the tower, elevator tower, and maybe some of the siding materials, and also the landscape plan. And so the staff report does identify that the Open Door Clinic and their team are working on addressing those, and we'll bring those back to the Planning Commission for your recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe, and we can assume that would be at that January 28th meeting?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Are there any questions of staff on that report? Yeah?
Hi. Most of the questions I have are actually things that either the city engineer or the project engineer might want to respond to, but I'll just put them all out, and then whoever gets to them first gets to them first. First, I'm wondering about the project reports denotation of the project as rural healthcare And it shows up again and again. I don't know if that's something that comes out of Open Doors' mission statement, or if it's something that the city has just adopted from that. I mean, certainly the city of Arcata is not rural, so when we're talking about services to benefit the city of Arcata, I'm just wondering where that comes from. The second question has to do with the location of the wetland mitigation area in Shea Park, and I'm wondering, none of the diagrams that we have for that show the location of the proposed additional roundabout at Foster and Alliance. And when I'm looking at that, I'm wondering how much room that allows for a sidewalk on that southeast side of the planned roundabout between that and the wetland mitigation site. It's hard to tell on the scale or on the diagrams, but they seem mighty close, so that may be something that one of the engineers can speak to, and it's certainly something that the final environmental impact report should include in those diagrams, because those two new features would be very close to each other and potentially not so compatible. Let's see. I had a question about the alternatives that were included in the scoping process. One of the alternatives that wasn't favored, obviously, was the location in McKinleyville. And part of the reason was that Open Door doesn't own the site. And I know at one point Open Door was considering a location adjacent to Mad River Hospital as well. And I'm wondering why, since Open Door doesn't own the McKinleyville site either, why that location wasn't included in the analysis. Let's see, finally, crosswalks. You asked about crosswalks. Is that something that the project description would need to include as a condition, or is that something that the city would plan later? Because safety-wise for patients at the clinic and workers there, it seems like it would be great to have a crosswalk from the clinic across the street to the south, and especially since you might expect that patients would be less likely to want to hoof it the extra 500 feet up the street than some of the people using one of the other crosswalks. I don't know where in the process the moving the crosswalk comes, or who pays for it, or anything like that. But since you asked. And finally, this issue of the mitigation, well, the non-mitigation, the cost share for the roundabout that was identified in the traffic study. The amount provided in that proportionate share was $146,000. I'm wondering, that divvying up of the cost was based on an assumption that I think the village project was going to be approved. And I'm wondering if the fact that that project wasn't approved actually would increase the proportionate share of Open Doors project to that total amount. And I don't think that that was addressed in the process that figured out what proportion each project would contribute, and that would be reflected in the development agreement. But certainly if the city wants to get that roundabout built, and you have a little bit less development or less intensive development sharing the cost, then it does seem like the cost might need to be reapportioned. So those are my questions.
I'll address a couple of these, and I think the
And they,
project.
they can address them too. That
Yeah,
would be great.
the project, the applicant may have something to say about the name of the, project and how it's described. But as far as the roundabout conflicting with the wetland, we can certainly bring a graphic of that. They don't conflict, but that is a good point. We definitely want to demonstrate that and show that. It's set back, and it was considered when we identified that area as a wetland mitigation site. The alternatives analysis, as you're aware, the EIR is required to provide a number of feasible alternatives. It's not required to evaluate all alternatives, and the statements as to how well those alternatives match with the project objectives are really where we weigh those costs and benefits of taking one of the alternatives as opposed to the proposed project. I think that selecting another alternative site, we picked one that was in McKinleyville as opposed to picking another site in Arcata. They don't have site access to either of those sites. They would have to obtain site access, but just to consider an option that isn't even in Arcata. What would the other impacts be at an off-site location that's not in Arcata? Certainly, if the Planning Commission is interested in adding another alternative, that's another off-site location within the city, we can do that. I think we'd probably be more general about it as opposed to identifying it specifically to a specific site. And I don't know if Open Door has anything to say about your question about Mad River, but staff doesn't at this point. I think Joe's probably got a lot more current and relevant information on the crosswalks, so I'll let him address those. But I know that the city engineer did say to me the other day that you don't want to use a crosswalk as a traffic calming device. Crosswalks are for people to walk across streets, and you don't want people to be the traffic calming device.
Yeah, I guess that's why I was asking about a crosswalk in that location when people come out the door. If they're going to the south, are they really, going to go to the end, or will they cross where they cross?
Yeah, I think that that's part of what the analysis is going to look at. This, again, just to give sort of an overview, or back to the overview for this meeting. This meeting is really designed, number one, for the Planning Commission to have plenty of time with the document, to get this document out early, to get the project out early, so you have plenty of time to consider and think about it. But it's also really designed to allow the public an opportunity to comment on the draft EIR. It's not required per CEQA to have a hearing on your draft EIR, but as a matter of practice, we like to do it because it opens up the public engagement. It provides more opportunity for people to come and comment and find out about the project. And so some of those project-specific decisions that will ultimately likely either be conditions of approval, you will put in a crosswalk here, or a city project that we take on at a later date once we've identified where those important pathways are. Do people find themselves, do we have a large volume of people finding themselves wanting to cross at that location? Or are they using other crosswalks? And then we would, based on where those use patterns are, decide. So I don't know, Joe may have additional information for you on the crosswalk, but I think that is not necessarily the purpose of this meeting. We'll come back with more information on that. And then in terms of the cost share for the traffic study, the costs were used as a method to give the city a starting point, if you will, in terms of what a mitigation measure could be, for these projects, in terms of their fair share allocation. The dollar value, the amount, and really the decision to require the projects to pay into this fund at all is in large part a policy decision. Now, we received good policy direction from the council and recommendations from the Planning Commission about the traffic study, and so we are executing that work on each of these projects. The sum total of the mitigation dollars that were going to be collected through these development agreements for that project were about 10% of the total project cost. And so, you know, none of these projects was approved at the time the mitigation measure was developed. And so at this point, you know, we wouldn't recommend trying to reallocate based on guesstimates as to whether or not a project would come through or not. If that subject site or, you know, one of the other subject sites ultimately isn't developed, all that will mean is that we'll have to, you know, derive sources from other, other either state grants or other developments as they come online. Ultimately, you know, even though the traffic study does consider the, you know, those mitigation measures as, you know, the payment into those mitigation banks as, you know, measured to offset the traffic impact, you know, the dollar value of those projects is so high, we're going to be, you know, collecting these funds, and really it's probably going to be Humboldt State University and Caltrans that pay the lion's share of this. So I think it's still valid to say, hey, you're having an impact, here's a proportional share. The city council could even come back later and say, well, you know, we're actually going to ramp this down to 8%, or, you know, and so those dollars are less. The actual dollar value is less relevant than to say that, you know, you're going to pay into this proportional share. And if this traffic study ultimately translates into a mitigation program where we're collecting fees, you know, on a regular basis, we'd have some other metric to calculate it, number of, you know, traffic miles or, you know, parking spaces or some other metric that we would use to evaluate that project's contribution to this.
Thanks, that's super helpful. One other thing to add to the wetland issue. I'm wondering if there's a way to show us where the spring is that's feeding that wetland, because from my reading and the map, it looked like it was kind of right under the corner of the building. So maybe the engineer can speak to how do you deal with a spring at the corner of the building.
And I just want to point out that the traffic study that is part of the appendices of the draft environmental impact report does include a graphic of that roundabout improvement at Foster and Alliance, and the wetland areas would be in this area. So really it's not, the improvements to that roundabout would not affect any of the project that would be mitigated with the wetland.
Thank you, Joe. Other questions?
I just have a quick question about, I read or was told that the bus stops were going to be down by the skateboard park. Is that right, for both sides?
Correct. No. Well,
Or both?
the westbound will be within the pullout of the skate park.
Okay.
And then the other bus stop will be on Sunset at just between, it will be east of the roundabout and east of the intersection where the first stop sign, where you come to the intersection of H Street and you have the off-ramp where the cars coming off southbound 101. And I talked to Netra about that.
Do you mean
and
west of between?
Well, let me get the graphic. I'll show you.
The reason I'm asking is I'm just thinking realistically, I think a lot of their patients are going to use public transportation. And I'm thinking the closer, the better. I'm, you know, a mother with her kids trying to get her kids out. I know it's a short distance, but herding, you know, some little kids to the clinic, I would think right in front would be better if possible. And seniors and anybody, you don't go there because you feel good. So it'd be nice if you could park right in front or get dropped off right in front, if possible.
Duly noted. The traffic study did recommend the bus stops where their location, and that was information that was taken in from the city engineer at the time. And, really the bus stop is, it benefits other users besides the open door clinic and stuff like that. But I think the city engineers looked at the most beneficial and best place to put it. So, but we'll duly note that and have a response for that within the final. But let me go ahead and I'll show you where those are proposed. And there is I believe we do have a design of the, oops, too far. I'm trying to do too many things here.
Is there room for, or is it's not gonna hold up traffic when the bus stops, right? Because it's already bottleneck right there during certain times of the day.
So the westbound bus stop will be within this area, so the bus will actually pull off. The other bus stop will on the eastbound will be in this area here, and the majority of bus stops in the city of Arcata are on the street. So there is no pull-off area. So this would be no different than like 90% of the bus stops in Arcata.
So somebody's gonna have to walk all that way. That's a long ways to walk when you're elderly or you have kids.
Duly
Anyway.
noted.
Yeah,
I'm just thinking about how the convenience.
Too.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah, we'll ask the city engineer to kind of come back with the rubric they used for why the location is where it's at.
Thank you. Are there any other questions of staff on that report? Clarifications? No? Before? John? Okay. So why don't we move on to the public comment portion of the meeting? It's typical for the applicant to have the first turn at the mic.
Good evening. My name's Laura Kadlacek, and thanks a lot for hearing this again and staff report. Thank you, Joe. I'm going to have Cheyenne address a couple of your questions relative to the rural health care and also the alternative analysis and Mad River Hospital. The location of the wetland, I think, has essentially been addressed. Your question about its potential conflict with the roundabout, so I think we're okay with that one. The crosswalk that is proposed, I guess I just reiterate that we are working with the Traffic Safety Committee and also the Coalition for Responsible Transportation Priorities. I think, well, as representative of the applicant, I think a crosswalk is appropriate there as well. So we're working to that end. The spring on the corner that you mentioned, I could just point it out. It's, or if Joe, it'd probably take a while to get the visual up, but it's right about here, and it drains during the wintertime into the two wetlands that are just below it, which are in Appendix B, I believe, of the Aquatic Resources Report. So it's not underneath the building. And if you have further questions, I could have our architects respond to that, but at this phase, we're looking at making sure that there's a French drain on that side of the building in order to keep water away from the building. And then the bus stops that were just mentioned, the reason why it wasn't put on Foster is because the city engineer did not want a bus stop stopping on Foster, from what we understand. I guess the category of the road isn't appropriate for having the bus stop in the middle of the lane. That's kind of how I understood it. So they proposed that we move it, down to where it is proposed now, across from the skate park. So, and we understand that is a little bit of a distance. I know, Cheyenne, if you want to mention that, we do have a lot of patients that come for a variety of ways to the clinic. Some even do dial-a-ride and those kinds of things. So it's duly noted that it is a little bit far to put a bus stop, on Open Doors property, we just didn't feel like the project would still be feasible with any less area for us to build on, because it's already, the new extension has already taken up a portion of the property and the roundabout, so it's really already squeezed down. And if we were to take that strip and, move it onto our property, we would lose a lot of parking, and it would make the project almost infeasible. I mean, we're really very tight as it is, as you can see from the site plans. Okay, so with that, Cheyenne, you want to come up, and our COO is going to answer a couple of your other questions.
Cheyenne Spetzler, Open Door. So the first question was about why rural, and it's a national definition, population per square mile. Eureka's not rural, Arcata actually is, and we feel really committed to advocating for rural health because, while we think we're a big town and are important in our world, we get left behind all the time when Sacramento starts to make decisions. We get overpowered really easily by Southern California. And so we have a chip on our shoulder. We're rural, and, and we're always going to stand up for rural so that we get our fair share. So that's why. We probably mentioned it too much. I think the wetland mitigation has been addressed. Mad River. So I always wanted this to be at Mad River. We had a nice location there. It seemed like a great co-location. We wanted to have the clinic there also, just to anchor our small hospital, which we care about too. And so that's not quite 20 years worth of trying to make that happen. And unfortunately, the land at Mad River Hospital is owned by, earlier, we might have made it work because it was owned by doctors, a group of doctors. And so we had an agreement at one point with those doctors to buy the land, get the lot line adjustments that would be needed to make it into one parcel and put the clinic there. And that just never worked out. Even as little as a year ago, I was still talking to Mad River and trying to make this work, but now most of those doctors aren't around. It's their heirs. The complexity of getting a free and clear parcel to build on is not going to happen in my lifetime, I'm pretty sure. And so, just right now, with the property we have, with the opportunity we have to move forward in the next couple years and actually have the clinic completed. With our aging infrastructure here, we're worried about some kind of catastrophic failure, so getting it done now is really important to us, so that's why not Mad River. Yeah. Let's see, what else can I talk to? Oh, I probably shouldn't talk about that, so I won't.
Well, with that not said, is there anybody else that would like to address us on this matter?
I want to know what it is.
Anybody else from the public have a comment on this topic at all?
Hi, I'm Michael O'Brien. I'm with the architect that's designing the clinic. Just a brief update, but to reiterate what Joe said, we are working on addressing a number of issues, including the landscaping, the finishes on the exterior, which we will provide supplemental information on that prior to the next meeting, so there's some time to digest it by staff. And then we'll go over it in that January 28th meeting. So we do intend on addressing all of those issues and providing additional information that was requested. So thank you.
Great, thank you. If there's nobody else from the public, we'll close this portion of the meeting. Seeing none, okay, we can move on to commission deliberations and/or moving this on forward.
Do we need a motion to continue it, or is that automatic? Okay.
There will be no continuation on this item. It will be separately noticed due to the recommendations that we're making for the planning commission or the city council.
So all you're looking for from us is any additional feedback or questions that we have about,
Yeah, certainly
The
with the draft
EIR.
environmental impact report and the entirety of the project itself, so we can try to incorporate those into one document that you'll be able to review and possibly forward on
yeah.
to the commission or the council.
Anything new from the draft EIR and/or lingering thoughts from last time?
It's going to be a cool project.
Yeah. It's a great draft EIR. It was a good read. It looks thorough. The mitigation's wonderful. Right down the street. I can't think of anything else to ask or say about it. And I'm super enthused about the project. I think we all are. So, I don't know. You don't need a motion, nothing else. That's it. We're moving forward, huh? Okay. All
I
right.
just had a quick question. From the last meeting, there were some questions about the generator, and there was a suggestion of maybe, or a question about a lid just to mitigate further noise from neighbors. Was anything ever, is that to come later, or?
That's also on their checklist of things that they're looking at and will bring back to us and stuff like that. So,
we'll hear
yeah,
about that
yeah.
on 128.
No, we haven't forgot that one, but yes. No.
Okay, and same thing with softening of the landscape.
It looks like the architect would like to make a comment on that. Let's hear it.
We'll be bringing a number of bits of information, just kind of redefining and readdressing how the sound moves. There's a number of given Caltrans documents regarding CMU walls and sound transfers, and we're even doing some tests on some of the other sites and running the generator, seeing how much sound decibels it's running at on inside the area, outside the block wall. We can't give you much more information right now because part of the height of the walls, all of that is defined by size of the unit, the decibels that the unit provides, and that kind of builds into an equation that says, okay, you should build your wall this high to prevent sound transfer. So, but we will be providing additional information on that as well.
Okay, thank you. So with that, we'll just see you guys on January 28th for the rest of the story, huh? All right, thank you all for coming.
Joe's taking his box and going home.
No pizza for us.
Good night, Joe. All right. As we finish our transition here, we will move on to our next public hearing in the evening, which is to consider a historic landmark designation recommendation for the Chapman House at 974 10th Street in Arcata. Yes.
I just need to mention that I own the property diagonal from that property, which I mentioned at the last hearing in regards to the same site, and I still own that property, and I still don't see any issue with any kind of conflict of interest.
Thank you for mentioning that, Mike. It wasn't a problem last time. It shouldn't be a problem this time. Can we have a staff report?
Yes. So this is my first presentation to the Planning Commission, so I prepared a PowerPoint, and I hear that's not typical, but it made me feel better. Oh, great. Don't tell me that. Yeah, so I told David it would be about 30 seconds per slide. We're going to see if that was accurate. And so here we go. So this project is a historic landmark designation for the Chapman House, along with some preservation incentives we're going to go over after that. The applicants are Scott and Sandra Hunt. They are here today, along with their agent, Bill Hull, who I'm assuming will also fill in some of the details I may leave out after my presentation. So here is the staff recommendation. We are recommending you adopt Resolution PC 1909, recommending approval to the council of a local historic landmark designation for the Chapman House and accompanying historic landmark overlay zone designation, along with associated incentives and Class 1 and Class 31 CEQA exemptions. So the attachments in your packet are the resolution I just mentioned. That's on page 112 of your packet. The landmark designation materials submitted by the applicant on page 130, and the Mills Act application materials on page 138. So I'm basically going to go over some of those materials that the applicant submitted now. So again, these are the three things we're going to be talking about tonight: designating this house, creating the overlay zone, and the preservation incentives. This is the subject site, 10th, and this is the zone. You see that it is a residential low-density zone, but it's located directly adjacent to a commercial zone, and that will come up again later, so keep that in the back of your mind. I just wanted to run through a couple of pictures. This is the site on Google Street View, May 2018. So this was about a year ago. This is what the front of the property looked like and the side of the property. And this is the property now. These are the photos that were submitted by the applicant of the front and side of the building. And this is the garage that was mentioned. This is something that came before the Planning Commission last year, I believe. So throughout this project, it's been a few years since they obtained the property and began repairs. They followed, when possible, the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation, which mostly means repairing whenever you can, keeping all the existing, and replacing in kind only when you have to. They also reconstructed several elements that had been missing from the site for a long time, and I think Bill could fill in more information about that if you wanted to know. They also created ADA access to the site and repaired a pretty significant amount of sidewalk, in my understanding. So here are some of the justifications for listing. I should mention that these justifications were reviewed by the Historic Landmark Committee prior to coming before the Planning Commission. First of all, it is an excellent representative example of Italianate architecture, and I just wanted to take a second, and on page 132 of the packet, there's a quote from Susie Van Kirk that says, the editor of the Humboldt Times called it the finest there is in this section, and probably there is no dwelling in the county that will compare with it in appearance when it was created. It also has maintained a significant amount of architectural integrity. It has been pretty much unchanged for years, but it's even more has even more integrity now than it did previously with the improvements that the applicants have made to the site in recent years. It's also associated with John Chapman, an early settler of Arcata and a historic partial owner of the Jacoby's Storehouse. And last but not least, it's already listed on the National Register for Historic Places, which I think is a pretty good indicator that it has a significant amount of eligibility for a local listing. So the requested incentives, kind of changing topics here, are these three: fee waivers for certain planning and building permits through the city as a part of this process, expanded allowed uses and an associated parking waiver for those uses if they are used in the future, and then also a Mills Act agreement. So I started recently and just wanted to run through these things really quickly for your benefit and mine. I know there are some recent additions to the Planning Commission, but the purpose of rehabilitation incentives in the city are intended to encourage the maintenance, preservation, and rehab of designated historic landmarks and noteworthy structures, and are applicable to sites that are designated with the HL combining zone, which is what we are deliberating on tonight. I've highlighted some of the exemptions and incentives that apply to this project. This highlighted one is a general incentive, and it discusses parking exemptions, fee waivers, Mills Act, property tax abatement programs are listed, as well as other incentives deemed necessary and expanding uses in certain residential zone districts. So the requested fee waiver is for $7,952. This is not the total amount that they spent on permits. That would be closer to $15,000, but these are the basically staff recovery costs and are not enterprise fees, which includes things like improvements to the wastewater treatment plant and updates to the general plan. Those typically are not waived. this fee waiver comprises less than a 1% reduction in the total project cost. A similar project that came before the commission was for the Daggets. I think that was a couple years ago. That fee waiver represented almost a 10% reduction in project cost as a comparison. So the expansion of allowed uses, this is one that I definitely want you guys to pay particular attention to. There's more information about it on page 109 of your packet. These are the uses that were requested by the applicant. To be clear, they have no immediate desire to use any of these. It's functioning as a vacation rental and they want to keep it that way. But this was something that they thought they would request while they were already getting their entitlements. Again, this is the site. You'll see it's located directly adjacent to a commercial zone. The majority of the uses that they requested are principally permitted in the adjacent zone, and no parking is required for uses in the central commercial zone as well. So again, this is the site. And this is what packet page 109 shows. Basically a comparison of the residential low density zone and the central commercial zone, what's principally permitted, what requires a use permit, and what is just flat out not allowed at all. You'll see that a couple of the things that they requested, including vacation rental and residential care facility, are already principally permitted. So obviously we said that was fine to continue. And then the majority of the other ones that were principally permitted in the central commercial zone, we said yes, we recommend that those are principally permitted as well. You'll notice the one difference is for these bar, tavern, pub, and restaurant, cafe uses. A bar requires a use permit in every zone. There is no zone that does not require a use permit, so we felt it was appropriate to continue to require a use permit. And for a restaurant, cafe, coffee shop, we had some deliberations about that, but determined a minor use permit would probably be most appropriate, but clearly that's the Planning Commission's final determination and then council. And then the Mills Act, this is kind of an interesting one. I understand the Mills Act is not something that has been used very many times in the past in Arcata. And this is an unusual project because a lot of the work on the site is already done. Not all work, but a lot of it. I reached out to the State Office of Historic Pres, and they said that that is not problematic, and it is up to local jurisdictions to regulate when the work is done. Our adopted guidelines do not specify when the work needs to be completed. And as the intent of the program is to incentivize rehabilitation and continued use, the project seems to fit the intent. And the anticipated savings on property tax is $7,000 to $40,000 over a 10-year period. I'll have David speak to that a little bit more because he worked more closely with the applicant in discussing those numbers. Again, this is our recommendation that I went over at the beginning, and we'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have, and I'm sure the applicants and agent would as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dila. Are there any questions about that staff report? No? None? Okay. I have none at this point either. So let's open this up to the public for public comment.
I'm sorry, I had one more quick thing. We did get a letter of support from the public, which I'd be happy to send around if that's typically how we do it. Oh, okay. Well, it expresses strong support for the project, and we will make photocopies. Thank you.
Thank you. If the applicant or their agent would like to address the commission, now's your opportunity.
Hi, I'm Bill Hull. Working with the owners here as a consultant on this project. And I submitted a bunch of writing that you have in your packet, but unless you have any direct questions about, there's a lot of words and a lot of lingo in all this. And I really think it's a great project to support, and I think it's been really well put together by the staff. It has been, there's a lot of pieces that come together for something like this, and it really presents itself well, and unless you have questions, that's my input, which I've already said in writing. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Are there any additional comments from the applicant? No? Okay. We will close that portion of the meeting and go on to commission deliberations and/or a motion on the side.
Well, when I saw this on our agenda, my first thought was, well, why don't we just have this on the consent agenda? Because it seems so obvious. And after reading the material, I still feel the same way. And I just want to say that I totally agree with the way staff has categorized the permitted uses versus the use permit and minor use permit. It seemed like the right thing to do.
Thank you. Anybody else? Sure. I just want to follow up by briefly saying, too, that I am totally impressed with the amount of historic detail that the applicant has put into this project, and can't imagine them not qualifying for landmark designation. And if the city is comfortable with all of the incentives, then who are we to judge, at this point? I mean, it's the city's math. And if you're recommending it, yeah, it must be fit within your parameters. So I think it's a great project, and I'm truly impressed by how far you guys have gone with the details. Any other comments or a motion?
I have a comment.
Yeah, please, Mike.
Were you going to go first? No. I would just comment that that one that's requiring the minor use permit, was it the cafe or something? For the cafe possibility, I guess I would, I don't know, some of the residential places around there, they might be more comfortable having that go through the conditional use permit instead. Would that be the alternative to the minor use?
Yeah, the alternatives would be to either not allow it at all, make it principally permitted, so there's no planning permit requirement. The difference between a conditional use permit and a minor use permit is the hearing body.
Yeah.
The zoning administrator is the hearing body for a minor use permit. And so that's certainly to your discretion. The same notification requirements are made. In general, the minor use permit heard by the zoning administrator is appealable to the planning commission. And if there's a lot of controversy associated with a project, although I do have the authority to approve a project, at that level, my feeling is that it's a better public process to allow a 7-member board decide on projects that have a lot of controversy than to have a one-person board do that. And so in general, I don't want to say that I will always make that decision, but in general, that's my rule of thumb. So it's to your discretion if you feel like the decision based on that same noticing requirement that a conditional use permit, or we just refer to them as use permits, is given for a minor use permit, and so the ability for the public to participate and engage and even request that, hey, why are you as a single individual making this decision? It should go to the planning commission. Those discussions can still be had.
So if it was the minor use permit, it could go to you and not come to the planning commission. If it was a conditional use, and it would be pretty much the same work on the applicant's part, but it would go to it would have to go to the planning commission, but it could just be on the consent item, or no, it would have to be.
No, we'd have a public hearing on it. Yeah,
okay.
It's if it's a discretion.
It would be noticed.
And it would be noticed. Both have the same noticing requirements.
Right.
Generally, the way a project like this would be handled, or a project subject to a minor use permit would be handled, is that notification goes out. If that project generates a lot of controversy, it's my belief that it's in the public's interest to have a larger board, the full planning commission, make that decision. Any decision that I can make, I can forward to the planning commission. And so really the major difference between those two processes on the front end for applicants is that a minor use permit is more cost effective. It's cheaper to get a minor use permit.
Right.
You know, as Dilo pointed out, this project site is right on the edge of the commercial central zoning district. It is firmly embedded in a residential low-density district, but there's a lot of commercial activity, and the way that the project faces onto the street, it's a commercial street, even though there's some residential across the street, residential zoning across the street. It's really a commercial extension of the commercial central. So I think that these incentives, again, the incentives for historic landmarks in residential low-density zones to allow them to do other commercial activities is really designed to allow the flexibility to create a revenue stream to maintain the property. This home or this building is going to be costly to maintain. It's been costly to improve, but it's going to be an ongoing cost to maintain. And so really what we're trying to do is learn from historic landmarkings in the past where we've said, oh, you can do a doctor's office, and then they have to come back, and when they want to rent it out to a dentist, they have to come back and get their zone amended. We're trying to head that off early and really select as many different uses that staff believes are compatible with that area and bake them into the original zoning ordinance.
Gotcha. And they would also still be required to pay the TOT for the transient occupancy tax for the vacation rentals, right? So
Absolutely.
there'd still be that income as well to the city. Okay.
Yeah, and really the difference on the Mills Act and in the revenue, we've been sort of finessing those numbers. We need to work with the county assessor to really get a firm handle on what that number would be. And it's anywhere in the range, as Dilo pointed out, from 7 to 40,000.
It's a big range.
Yeah.
It's a big range. It's probably more, the lower end is probably more likely 40,000. And the upper end may be as much as even 100,000 over that 10-year period, so 10,000 a year. And essentially what we're saying as a city to the Hunts is we would like you to continue to keep this building in this condition. Please use this $10,000 a year to do so. And unlike, as Dilo had pointed out, unlike many Mills Act contracts that we're likely to get into in the future, instead of having the work plotted out over a 10-year period where, we're, monitoring and making sure that they're performing and implementing that, roof replacement or the window replacement on the schedule that they said they were going to do it on. In this case, it's all front-loaded. We're getting it up front, and there's no credit involved. We already know that they did a fantastic job on the project. So, we believe that there's a sufficient, even if it's up to $100,000 a year, sufficient investment on the owner's part for us to contribute that towards this community good.
Did you mean 100,000 over 10 years?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I said 100,000 a year, didn't I? Okay. 10 years, 10 years.
Sorry, Hans. And just getting the landmark designation opens up some more options with the property. Is that correct in terms of usage?
Well, the process to identify those uses is really through this landmark. So the ordinance that's adopted ultimately based on your recommendation will identify the types of uses. There are some uses, some incentives that are allowed by right just by having a landmark structure. But these additional uses, and I believe we included in the conditions of approval, as we've done on a couple of other projects, where the director can evaluate uses that are similar to. So it may not be specifically identified on, but you won't have to come back for a zone amendment just because you have a use that's similar to or has the same impact as. But it's not explicitly listed.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question about the use permits for numbers 8 or 9, the bar, tavern, pub, restaurant, cafe, coffee shop. And you had recommended a minor use permit for the restaurant, cafe, coffee shop, but a use permit for a bar, tavern, or pub. And if you could explain the difference to us process-wise between the use permit and the minor use permit, I'm kind kind of leaning towards saying maybe both of those should be subject to a conditional use permit, especially if alcohol in late night hours would be involved at that location. Not to say it couldn't happen, but it would allow the public to have some input into the conditions.
Yeah, again, both of the processes are the exact same. There's a 10-day notice given, staff report generated, a public hearing held. The nearby residents are notified by mail and publication in the paper. The hearing is held, findings need to be made, conditions of approval can be included. The main difference between a minor use permit and a use permit is the hearing body. A minor use permit is heard by the zoning administrator. A use permit is heard by the planning commission, except in cases where the minor use permit requires an EIR. So that's really the main difference. As Dilo had mentioned, there's nowhere in the city where a bar is allowed without a full use permit. Restaurants are generally principally permitted in those zoning districts, commercial zoning districts. And I think that the rationale behind requiring any kind of permit at all, planning permit associated with this at all, is to provide that additional notification. Certainly, as I mentioned before, if a project does generate considerable controversy, I know past zoning administrators and more than likely future zoning administrators, in order to build and keep the public trust, would continue to forward those more controversial decisions to the full planning commission body. Again, it is certainly up to the commission to make a recommendation on that. Staff believes that a minor use permit is sufficient to generate enough public notice to determine whether or not there's that controversy. Otherwise, it should be a principally permitted use. And it does so in a fairly cost-effective way for the applicant or for the owner.
Quick follow-up on that. If a place gets permitted as a restaurant and then later applies for a license to sell alcohol, does it then go back through channels or?
So an alcohol license for a restaurant is principally permitted. So there's no additional review for a restaurant that sells alcohol. And the distinction between bar, tavern, pub, and restaurant, cafe, and coffee shop in our land use code is really based on what their primary function is. And so you can imagine there's a little bit of balancing. If you have a bar, at what point do peanuts become tapas, become a full order? And conversely, if you came in and you said, hey, look, I've got this restaurant and we're like the world's greatest peanut in a dish restaurant, all you can order is peanuts in a dish, we're probably going to cry foul and say, no, that's a bar, you need to get a use permit. So a restaurant, while it doesn't have to, if it's a breakfast place and doesn't have to serve alcohol, but there's no additional requirement and there's no use permit required for restaurants that do serve alcohol.
Okay, thank you.
There is, however, let me back up one step on that. There is, however, a difference in ABC licensing. And so the county, I believe, has a capped number of full bar licenses. And so if they wanted to open a restaurant and they wanted to have a full bar license, those aren't just an endless supply of those. They would have to purchase one from a full bar that was closing down.
I had a quick question with regards to that. So, say, for example, they did want to apply for a full bar hard liquor license. That would go through the ABC, not necessarily then through the permitting process?
Oh, yeah, no, I'm sorry. I confused the issue. That would go through both processes. They would be required to obtain a license from the ABC, and they would also be required to obtain a use permit from the city.
Okay, so whether or not they were approved by the ABC, they would still need to. And then
That's correct.
Another question, and I apologize, I'm still new, but kind of piggybacking on this same thing of, you said that the big difference between the two permits was really just the cost? How big is that differential cost? Is that something that can be easily answered?
Yeah, no, it's the cost, the initial deposit, and the hearing body. And so for a minor use permit, the zoning administrator hears it, and I don't have the fee resolution memorized, but I believe it's around $2,000.
Versus,
It's around $6,000 for a planning commission hearing. And the planning commission hears it.
thank you.
So we are looking for a motion and/or an amended motion, if that's what somebody wants.
Just as a comment, I mean, I would be interested in doing it where just those two items, 8 and 9, were conditional use permits rather than minor use. I just feel a little more comfortable with that, just because it would have a fairly big effect. I do understand the other side of it as well. I just think just on a little bit on the, I'd be a little more comfortable on that end, and it sounds like maybe some others on the planning commission would.
Yeah, I concur.
Yeah, I think one of the things that would be in our interest in doing a use permit for both of those, it would eliminate that question of how many peanuts they're serving versus how much alcohol is being served. And it would also, once a decision is made, give them the flexibility to change their menu if they wanted to without coming back to the commission. So I guess I would go for the more restrictive, more public version up front, but then give them the flexibility to make good business decisions after that.
Okay. Yeah, so we're, if there's no further discussion on that item, then we're just looking for a motion.
Well, I still feel that the minor use permit process is appropriate, but the whole question is so hypothetical that, you know, I'm okay with however we do it.
Yeah, to be clear, they're not proposing this at any point in the near future, so I'm sure they'd be happy either way to get the approval tonight.
All right, thank you. Go ahead.
I want to make a motion to approve Resolution PC 19-09 with the amendments of, under the use type, 8 bar, tavern, pub, and 9 restaurant, cafe, and coffee shop be conditional use permit required.
If I could just, for clarity, we don't have conditional use permits, we have use permits.
Oh, use permit, I'm sorry. Use
Sorry to be a
permits.
stickler.
Do we have a second on that?
I second that motion.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Well, I hope that feels right to you guys. Thank you for the great project.
I'd like to
your
congratulate
input.
Dilo on her first ever
Thank you,
Planning
Dilo.
Commission staff report. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
I think all of your slides were 30 seconds, right on. Yeah, yeah. All right, we have about 1.5 more items to get through here. Our next public hearing item is to adopt resolution number PC 19-08, recommending the City Council adopt the draft housing element pending State Department of Housing and Community Development, HCD certification. Can we have a staff report?
Yes. So we recommend that the Planning Commission open the public hearing and receive public testimony, review the draft housing element and provide comments, and adopt Resolution PC 1908, recommending the City Council adopt the draft housing element pending State Department of Housing and Community Development certification, and also, I apologize that this isn't on there, adopt the addendum to the negative declaration prepared for the 2014 housing element update. and the notice of exemption based on the common sense exemption, which David will go over with you a little bit later on. I think the last time we brought this to you was November 12th and reviewed some of the draft implementation measures at that time. We've gone back and forth a little bit with HCD, and so the housing element before you tonight has a lot of their comments incorporated into that. Actually, it should have all of their comments incorporated into that, since we did get a letter from them on December 6th indicating that our revisions met their certification requirements. We also incorporated some comments that we received from the public, so I want to go over a few of those with you as well. So I'll go through, if you don't mind, real briefly, a couple of the major changes and kind of where they came from, so it makes a little more sense. The first is a policy. So if you turn to packet page 164, housing element 13. The Coalition for Responsible Transportation Priorities brought this to our attention, that it was the original policy was in conflict with several other policies, as well as some of the implementation measures. So we revised that to be really clear that we do want to prioritize high-density, mixed-income infill housing projects that improve alternative transportation, and kind of how we plan on doing that. So that was one of the revisions based on some of the public comments that we received. That actually was brought up in the city council meeting, the last city council meeting as well. And then as far as the implementation measures, if you go and you look through some of the implementation measures, I think implementation measure 5, there was a question from legal services.
What page are we on now?
Oh, that's on page, I apologize, that's on page 172, packet page 172. And you'll see it's all in track changes version that will help. Underlined is the changes based on the last one that you saw. So there was some question about including something to really highlight the need for larger units, for larger families. So we incorporated that into the affordable multifamily housing, that we would definitely, want to look at projects that had that. So you'll see that change, and that was a comment that came from legal services. The next somewhat major changes on implementation measure 11, which is packet page 177. And really that was just reinforcing, promoting existing parking reduction alternatives for infill projects and incentives to promote mode shift and alternative transportation. So we really wanted to highlight that, and we felt that the infill development program was the place to do that. So that's, again, based on the comments that we received from Coalition for Responsible Transportation Priorities. Some of HCD's comments, if you go to packet page 180, implementation measure 14, which is residential relocation and anti-displacement. They really wanted us to reiterate that it's not just sites inside the coastal zone that would require replacement. There have been some changes to state law that actually require that if affordable housing is demolished throughout the city, not just in coastal zone, that it needs to be replaced. So that's something that we just added the language there based on HCD's request. The next one is implementation measure 19. That's okay. I do that too all the time. The next one's implementation measure 19, which you'll see at the very end there. It just talks about SB 35 streamlining, and that was something that HCD required that we add to that implementation measure, so that additional language was added there. There wasn't a whole lot there. I think what you're going to find, though, the major changes, there was a little bit of addition to implementation measure 20, which is on the same page. Primarily, they wanted us to, at the very end of that implementation measure, really go over how many acres we're talking about in the Arcata Gateway Specific Area Plan, how many of those are in the coastal zone, how many of those are outside of the coastal zone, how many of them are vacant. And in the appendices, you'll see some more detailed information about those sites that are included in that potential specific area plan area. So there's a lot more detail in the appendices in regards to that, and so we added some additional language in here.
I had a quick question for you also.
Go ahead.
When we talk about affordable housing, just for people that are watching this, it's a strict definition of what affordable housing is, right? It's not like affordable for some people, not for others, but there's a very strict definition for that.
There is a definition for that, yes. And it's regulated affordable housing is what we're generally talking about.
Right.
You can count some units if you know what the rents are and they fall in that category of affordable rents as affordable housing. But typically, what's built in the city for very low and low income affordable housing would be restricted. It's generally based on a regulatory agreement, and it's something that they go and enter into with HCD and with the city. So most
And
of
that-
our,
A lot of times that, to make that work financially, there are grants and stuff that are in place and things like the couple projects that we recently worked on and stuff.
yes, generally speaking, yes.
Thank you.
Sure. So the next, if you go to, go ahead.
Sorry. I just wanted to add that, to your comment, that the city usually has some sort of money involved, some sort of a grant involved, that, one of the programs here, the infill program that we'll be, we've been talking a lot about over the last year, and we'll be working to, create the actual document over the next year or so, includes actually incentivizing mixed income developments by creating principally permitted pathways to those developments. And so instead of giving financial assistance, we'll be using the zoning assistance, if you will.
So the next implementation measure 21 was actually added, new residential zoning district, HCD, because we were using some of the units in the Creekside development towards our count for the total RENA numbers. They really wanted us to be very clear that if in fact Creekside does not go through, that we will look at rezoning to create those additional units. They wanted us to be very explicit in the implementation measure about that. So if you review that, that's basically what that says is if it does not get completed, that we are going to be required to find those additional, I think it's 85 units, 89 units somewhere else. So we have to replace those if in fact that does not go through. HCD also required that we add in our local coastal program update, which we're in the process of working on, and it's going to be coming back to you, I'm sure, here in the near future. And we did receive a Coastal Commission grant in order to get that update approved, so we're working on that right now. So more to come on that. They just wanted us to add that in. And another thing that came up was we had identified the REACH code as a potential government constraint. And so HCD did ask us to add an implementation measure to review that and evaluate the impact on financial feasibility of housing developments based on that REACH code. I believe we're in a situation at this point where the state's requirements and our REACH code are equal, or the states are more restrictive, so we're not in a situation. But if it does come back where the city adopts a REACH code that's more restrictive than the state, really trying to find out what those, what that means to our housing development. They wanted us to identify that as an implementation measure. And then the last thing that was required was implementation measure 25, which is to evaluate allowed uses by zone. What they found was that some of our, and David may speak to this a little bit more too, but some of our allowed uses in the zoning districts weren't, needed to be updated. And so that's what that talks about. And then I'm going to let David talk a little bit about the CEQA and what the process is there, but we have kind of two different tracks that we're looking at. One is that the majority of the updates were just that, updates, and so an addendum to the 2014 negative declaration was appropriate. Some of the implementation measures are aren't something that we can necessarily look at yet because they're not site specific and we don't know exactly what's going to happen. So like the Arcata Gateway Specific Area Plan, for instance, is going to have its own environmental document.
And so that's going to be something that's going to come with those implementation measures directly. And so I believe that's what we were looking at with the common sense rule. But again, I'll let David speak to that more. Did anybody have any specific questions on any of the changes or anything that I didn't go over?
Go ahead, please.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Can I just say one real quick thing? I don't have anything to add about CEQA, and I think you covered everything. The only thing I wanted to point out to you before you go into your deliberations and questions is that on packet page 227, this is the portion of the housing element that's evaluating the current policies. So these are policies that are in our existing housing element. We have, I'm sorry, it starts on 226. It's housing element implementation measure number 34, the small unit density calculation. The intent behind this was to encourage, smaller units, basically market rate affordable units, by allowing a density bonus that calculates density based on the persons per household, as opposed to the total units allowable within that zoning district. If you can imagine, if someone had the ability to build 15 units on a piece of property, and that's all they could build, they would build those units to maximize the built-out floor area so they could get the highest rents possible for that space. But if you wanted to encourage them to build smaller units, even though it would take the same floor area, they might get 20 or 25 units in that same floor area. So this was an idea in the beginning of the last housing element, and we really implemented it only once so far on the Kramer project, the Sunset Terrace project, where the density wasn't based on a units per acre calculation, but it was based on a persons per household per acre calculation. And so it allowed for a higher number of units per acre, but it still houses the same amount of people. We've put into this analysis here that we're replacing this with other alternatives that we're looking at for for new programs. But I just wanted to be clear and point out now that this only will go away. We're going to have a new document, a new housing element that's not going to have this in one of the implementation measures, but we intend to continue to implement this, which requires a conditional use permit. Use permit. They would come to the Planning Commission and ask for the ability to add that density on a parcel by parcel basis until such time as this is replaced by that new implementation measure. So I just wanted to make sure that the Planning Commission was aware of that we'll continue to use that measure from our last housing element cycle to ensure that we have the ability to leverage site-specific market rate affordable housing. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay. You had a question?
That was actually really useful because it was going to be a Sunset Terrace hypothetical situation. So there you go. So I have a few questions. First off is back to the same stuff we mentioned last time about the RENA looks at housing units, but the basis for some of that has to do with projected population growth. And on page 230 of the packet, we still have a 2030 population that anticipates only 375 additional people in Arcata. And so I'm still kind of wondering about that. And I do get that with smaller households, you need more housing units even if you don't have more people. But I'm assuming that you kind of reviewed those pictures and just decided to run with that number. Is that?
Yeah, no, the RENA process, so there are a bunch of different models that are run that the HCD uses to, one, at the beginning, determine the allocation of housing need to the county as a whole. And there's a separate process that the county goes through, along with the other jurisdictions, to decide how to allocate those RENA to the different jurisdictions within the county. that's separate from the modeling that HCD has done for the data that they release that we're required to use to evaluate our housing element. So table A3-1 on packet page 230, was the original HCD data that they distributed to us, and they said, here, use this table. These are the projections. Derived completely separately from their population projections that arrived at the regional housing needs allocation in general, and then separate from that process we went through independently. So we've added table A32, which is some updated analysis that was done by our consultant AED, who's working on the infill market study. And these numbers, it's just a different population projection. You're going to find some challenges with this one. That they're showing the 2020 total. If you look in that first column, 2020 total of all population being 17,733. Well, our population estimates based on the area community surveys that we're somewhere around 18,500 now. I don't think we're going to have a population drop in the next couple of years. So these are modeled data, and I think that what we tried to do was to add additional description in the appendix as to how these different data work together, these different models work together. And then, the place where it was kind of, glaring, and you picked up on it, Commissioner Mayor, in the first hearing that we had with this first draft, is really on, packet page 158, the summary of the future housing needs, where in the very same paragraph we said, hey, look, we're going to grow by 300 people and we need 600 units to house them. So we addressed that language there and really tried to identify that, look, the population growth rates, depending on what your objective is for that modeling, and how sensitive you want to be to, or how conservative you want to be. Generally speaking, we use 1%, for example, on traffic studies. Oftentimes we've seen, population models that use 0.5% growth rate. And if you look back in time, we've had, on average in recent estimates, about 0.5% to 0.75% growth rate. So try to sort of bring all of those different and somewhat conflicting models together to say, hey, look, this is even a conservative estimate. If you were to say we're only going to grow by 0.5%, resulting population is going to be around 20,000 by 2027. That's still probably really low. I mean, if you think about it, we had a population projection for 20,000 by 2020. We're sneaking up on that, slowly and steadily. So, we do the best with the model data that we have. The one thing that is not changing is our regional housing needs allocation. And so even though it seems a little odd, we're playing the hand we were dealt.
You mean the 610 seems a little high? Is that what you mean by?
Yeah, 610 I don't think is high. 610 was actually derived from a model that looked at a little less than 0.5% growth for the county overall. We did not get a straight per capita allotment of that total for the county. So if you look at the tables on packet page 149, the total 3,390. The way we did not distribute that 3,390 in the bottom right-hand corner is to say, what's your current population? We're going to give you that proportional share of these new housing units, thereby densifying dense areas and not densifying non-dense areas. One of the requirements of the regional housing needs allocation process is to ensure that all jurisdictions within a county receive a fair share of housing allocation, and that it be based on a jobs housing balance. And so the model that the HCOG used to allocate these RENA to the jurisdictions looked at balancing and weighting the factors of existing housing and existing jobs equally. So it didn't even look at our population at all when it allocated the housing allocation. It looked at what proportion of the county's jobs do you have, what proportion of the county's housing do you have. The reason behind this, or the rationale behind it, is that those two metrics, if you balance based on them, will drive more housing towards existing employment centers. And so this year we took a slightly less aggressive approach towards the jobs housing balance and made it 50-50. Last cycle we balanced it at 60-40, 60 on the jobs. So if you had more jobs, you were allocating more housing units to that jurisdiction. So, ultimately, I don't want anybody to take away from this that the population estimates that are included in this housing element are, rock solid. I think that we have different different population projections, and we have to, sort of balance that with the gut check that, we're probably going to grow 0.5% or 1%, somewhere around in that range over the next 8 years.
That helps. I mean, I get that. I had a little bit of an eek when I saw that number was still in there. I'm wondering about something in implementation measure number 20 in the material that was added, and that's on page 185. To ensure low and very low income housing units are developed with the rezoned properties. It appears that we are reinstating inclusionary zoning. Is that your intention with that language?
I think what you're referring to is including principally permitted development pathways, inclusionary zoning scaled for feasibility.
Yep.
That's what you're talking about there. We are considering some type of, in these proposed rezone areas, inclusionary zoning of some sort, but not to say the way that we had done it in the past, because I think David could probably speak to this more, but I believe that there were some issues in the past that it actually deterred development, especially on smaller scale projects. I think if we were looking at inclusionary zoning as far as affordable housing on larger scale projects where we had some funding assistance, it might be something that would be workable. But I think that's why we added that scaled for feasibility sentence.
Okay, so, but it does open up the door again, especially on larger projects in rezoned areas. I'm excited about that. I actually thought we should have kept the inclusionary zoning when the commission voted against it, so I'm very happy to see that there. But I just wanted to make sure that's actually what you intended to put in there.
It's also something that came up with some of the public comments that we received as well. So.
Okay, great. Where else was there? There's a lot of stuff in here. There was something that showed up in that portion that you added for the transportation, alternative transportation projects, and I've marked it, and I just have to find it again. Basically, it was allowing projects that provided for encouraging alternative transportation to not be subject to some of the requirements. And
page 166, implementation measure 11, maybe?
Let me
packet
go.
Page 177, I'm sorry.
Okay, 177, we're going after
See if it's
it.
that one. If it's not, it's probably in policy 13.
In any case, wherever it went, and I can find it later, I noticed that one of the things that would be allowed to fall away in addition to parking requirements was landscaping requirements, and I would strongly recommend against that, simply because in terms of quality of life, making sure that we have the ability to review landscaping plans and to enforce those requirements, I think would actually eventually work with any types of form-based codes we might adopt, and giving up the ability to require good landscaping, I think is a big mistake there. So I'm fine with getting rid of the parking requirements, but I don't want to get rid of those landscaping requirements. And that was added language since the last draft, so.
I think you're referring to packet page 164, HE13, the policy.
164. Yep, that's where it is. It's HE13 right at the very end. And I think that you mentioned that was a policy that had been added at the urging of the Coalition for Responsible Transportation.
If I could clarify, the coalition pointed out that the language that's stricken, mostly on page 165, was inconsistent with the rest of the housing element. And we agreed with that analysis. This policy was a holdover from the last housing element, and I think, we had just overlooked the implications of the policy. In response, I want to be clear, the policy that you're seeing as a draft policy was not requested by CRTP-PT. They are policies that we've been discussing for the past year associated with the infill plan. And, as you'll recall from some of the study sessions we've had, the challenge with policy balancing when you have a, broad policy, document such as the general plan, and trying to implement those policies through land use code, where the intent is that you have these policies that are applicable citywide, is that on any given project site, sometimes the policies don't all balance equally. And so this was an attempt to really bring into stark relief the work that we've been doing over the past year in at least this first initial policy, to identify that infill development has benefits that go beyond just creating higher densities, but that the limitations based on the standards that apply to other areas in the city in order to get that more compact development, that those same standards can't apply equally. And I think to your point about the form-based code, one of the areas where I think this will be ultimately implemented is within the specific area plan, the Arcata Gateway specific area plan, which will have more of a form-based code approach. So having the option at that time when we're bringing forward the large-scale planning document to really decide where it's appropriate to eliminate things like landscaping or parking or other site standards, eliminate setbacks and that sort of thing, to create the ability to do that compact development. Because if you apply those standards, then you end up whittling away the allowable density on the site. You're limited by, all these various other site standards. So it's a way of really clarifying that in this particular area, we're going to balance the policy now. We're going to eliminate some of the policy requirements that we have writ large in the city so that we can create a specific kind of development in the site. The city council did have the benefit of looking at this language at their last city council meeting, and we didn't take a vote on it, but if I had to count twinkles, I would say that we had a unanimous support for this policy. So I do want the Planning Commission to know that. Certainly you can make a recommendation if the majority of you want to eliminate this policy, but this is kind of the anchor policy for this infill work that we're doing, and we're going to be able to point back to it as we start to adopt some of these other policy documents and the other policy changes in the general plan in general.
I guess I'm just wondering if pointing out that a form-based code is the way you're thinking of going with that, along with that, would perhaps be a more appropriate way of explaining that we're not just eliminating standards, we're setting alternative standards for those areas. The way this reads to me on its face, is basically just kind of throwing it up for grabs. As soon as a project has transportation advantages, everything else goes out the window. And I'm not sure that the city council would have seen it that way, but from the perspective of what the Planning Commission's job is in reviewing developments, this doesn't provide us with any other levers except to say that we could keep those or we could throw them out, but it doesn't point to the idea that there's still going to be standards that will apply other than on a case-by-case basis. So referring to some kind of form-based code or some alternative standard would be really helpful. But I'm not excited about the idea of including our landscaping requirements in there and ending up with, concrete and building right up to the curb on anything that has greater density and more transportation advantages. That on its face, that language gets rid of a little bit too much.
So just to be clear, am I to understand then it will take it case by case with regards to the landscaping? Or if they address transportation, alternative transportation issues, then that's off the table? They don't have to worry about any more landscaping?
Well, part of the language here is it says that it will receive incentives, including, okay, it doesn't say it may receive incentives. It says it will receive incentives, and then there's a long list of all those incentives.
Including but not limited to.
Including but not limited to. In other words, that's the starting point of the things we can get rid of. I'm not willing to put all of that in there as our starting point.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think, if the majority of the Planning Commission wants to make a recommendation to the City Council that they, modify this, you should talk about that for sure. I do want to point to, though, that this is a policy. It doesn't actually implement anything. So nobody can use this policy and say, okay, well, give me my landscape reduction incentive. The intent behind this policy is to be able to draft those more detailed implementations that implement this policy, and those will include that more detail that I think you're looking for, Commissioner Mayor. This policy ties to an implementation measure that identifies our infill plan. And it's, again, even in this implementation measure, it's not explicit because the intent of this document is not to fully outline and explore what those incentives would look like. Instead, it's to give the grounding and the basis for being able to make those policy decisions in the future. And the intent behind this particular policy was to really strike a firm note at this beginning stage to really draw into contrast the policies, the types of policies that we're talking about balancing for those infill programs.
Okay, first, we don't have the infill plan to look at yet. It hasn't been created. And a will is a strong statement. I'd probably be okay if we change that will to may. Will is imperative. And if that's our starting point and it's imperative, I think that we need alternative standards to link it to, and we don't have those here.
This is an explicit policy identifying the city's commitment to climate goals and infill development, and it is explicit. It's not a we will consider. It isn't a we'll study. It's a we will do this. We are going to do this. We're going to develop incentives through these programs, and I don't know that it's a fault that we don't have those explicit measures in front of us right now. We certainly can't wait to adopt this until we have those developed.
I'm sorry, I'm behind you, I suspect, but So am I understanding that it's definitive that this landscaping thing is not looked at as a case-by-case basis? Or is this just a policy measure as an incentivization for alternative transportation projects to give them more reasons to do it?
Right. No, it's a policy that's a very explicit policy that we will develop incentives such as when we create the infill plan. So it's a statement now that we can look back on when we're developing that new plan that's going to have those specific criteria of which projects would be eligible for these incentives and what areas we would apply these incentives to. That when we're developing that policy language, we don't have to hem and haw and wonder, should we be really prioritizing transportation and infill development? You know, how do we balance these things? We can point back and say, remember the conversations we had? We identified this in the housing element. We adopted it. We said we will implement these incentives through these, through this new zoning standard. So it's at that zoning standard stage where the decisions would be made, and the intent behind the infill plan is that, at least for the specific area plan, there wouldn't be a site-by-site decision on the ground when it's happening. We would make all of those decisions in advance. And so you might, as you're developing the form-based code around that specific area plan, you might say, look, these 3 city blocks, we want to eliminate the landscaping standards for because of the, the configuration of these parcels and the types of development we want to see on these parcels. We're going to make it such that there's no landscaping requirement and there are zero setbacks.
Is there any way to say alternative landscaping requirements rather than reduced landscaping requirements? Because I think that the way it's worded here, it basically takes landscaping off the table and says to the developer, landscape, don't landscape.
It's really important to keep into context what the effect of this policy is. This doesn't tell the developer anything. This tells us, this reminds us of the policy statement that we made in the future when we're developing those specific standards. It may be the case that, can you fire up the, it may be the case that there are some areas where we don't want to have landscaping, that we're perfectly willing to trade off and have zero landscaping. And we would identify that in those codes as we develop them. And it may be that we will only allow you to have zero landscaping if you're going to give us, at least 30 units per acre or something like that. Whatever the case may be. I mean, as we develop these standards and the incentives and the requirements, over the course of the next couple of years, those details will be fleshed out. That's not, those details and, that site-specific consideration isn't the intent of this policy language. Policy language is only intended to say, look, for some of these areas where we're really trying to concentrate infill, where we're really trying to meet our climate goals, we're really definitely trying to, encourage affordable housing and alternative transportation. In those areas, these are the kinds of trade-offs we're willing right here and now today to develop into our codes, so that when we all sit down around the table, or maybe it's some other combination, maybe it's not this group, maybe it's not me, but that we've made a policy statement for those decision makers and those staff members in the future to be able to look back and say, okay, I know what our marching orders are. We went through this big public process to get to the point where we are today. We know what we need to do with this. Let's do it now. So that's why it's so explicit. And again, I think the City Council has already reviewed this language and is comfortable with it. Certainly you should make a recommendation if you have a majority vote on that.
Is it considered in a normal practice in terms of greenhouse emission reduction to eliminate landscaping? I mean, is this come up often, or is it part of the dialogue?
The idea here is that, landscaping, site setbacks, floor area ratio, all of the standards that we have that we apply citywide in our typical zoning code those things are incongruent with really strong infill development policies at times on a site-by-site basis. And so the intent behind this policy, and the reason why it's a including but not limited to list, is just to give a sense for the kind of policy decision that we're making. Yeah, we love our landscaping. We love our on-site parking. We love our setbacks, et cetera, et cetera. But in some certain areas, we're willing to give those standards up to make sure that infill development is actually feasible, that compact high-density development is actually feasible.
So it's really just to allow more square footage to be lived on rather than landscaped.
Yeah, and it's
Intensify
lived on, and or if there's co-parking, maybe because of the configuration of parcels, it makes more sense to have like a co-parking area, or maybe it makes more sense to have an area that's more community oriented that has landscape and park amenities that were contributed to by a number of different projects in the surrounding area. Then they're not required to provide that landscaping, because what's a bigger public benefit if we got a half an acre of landscaped, grass, tree-lined, park-like setting that's available to the public, or a 5-foot strip of landscaping next to a building. So I think that a lot of this detail, a lot of the issues that we'll work through on a site-specific basis or in a area-specific basis, are yet to come. We'd have to reflect back on conversations that we've had about, how we're, going to need to be doing these policy balancings that we've, had discussing the infill plan. And really, this is the first time where we've come out with an explicit policy that does that.
So why wouldn't it say something like, or modified landscape requirements? That at least, this does make it sound like they could just get swept away, rather than that there are scenarios where you can reduce.
I have some proposed language that would, I think, address that issue. Fine up to will receive incentives. And then instead of the end of that sentence, the city will develop alternative criteria for such infill projects with regard to deferred fees, reduced development standards, parking setbacks, and landscaping. And that's something that can occur in the context of that infill specific plan or any other specific types of criteria we choose to impose. It gives you that emphatic statement that the city will support those projects, but it doesn't eliminate our discretion completely. And I feel pretty strongly about that. So,
well, I want to be clear, though, this does not eliminate any discretion. This doesn't eliminate anything at all. This gives more discretion, if anything. It gives the discretion to really craft specific implementation, zoning requirements, standards that accomplish the goals that we're trying to accomplish with the infill plan. So it adds discretion to the decision makers to create those plans that implement exactly what the community wants to see implemented.
So like on the Isaacson Ford project, where there was a request for a reduced, well, it was the lowest possible amount of parking on site. In this scenario, they may also be saying, and we'd like to also apply for or request a lower amount of parking. Landscaping.
No, really the intent behind this policy is that we will be using it in the specific area plan and infill plans that include real specific criteria. So I would change your scenario. Instead of the developer saying, look, we'd like to come in and we'd like to request to eliminate landscaping and eliminate parking, can you give us a few other incentives too? Instead of that, we would have gone through a process where we would have, let's say, done charrettes, and we would have, as a community said, we're willing to accept 4-story buildings here with no parking, and we want, even though 10% landscaping is required, we want 5% landscaping on this particular parcel because that's how this parcel configuration works. As long as you'll give us 20% affordable housing. You'll give us, high energy efficiency building and provide all of the residents with, with bus passes. And, okay, so that's that parcel. We're going to bake that into our zoning code. Next parcel over. We do this over and over and over again. We design out that specific area. And we say all of these different kinds of uses are allowable by right if you come in under these specific design standards. And so it allows the commission, it allows the council the flexibility and the authority and the recognition that the decision has already been made. We're not doing the cookie cutter zoning code that we have now and trying to somehow just add density. That will not work. We've seen it in the downtown. Downtown has residential high density zoning district density standards. So you can go up to 32 units per acre in the downtown, which sounds great, right? I mean, that's as high as you can get. So what more could you ask for? Well, think about the parcels in the downtown. If you look at them, they're all pretty small. Well, except for some are very large. But the plaza, for example, these are tiny little parcels. This one has 0.13 acres. So anyone who's quick with math and can multiply 0.13 by 30? About three. So your high density zoning district is going to give you 3 units on a parcel like this. And what this led to historically is that we'd had people who wanted to come in and create like 5 or 6 units on their property, but they couldn't. They were totally willing to put in the elevator or whatever was required to be able to, create that space, but they couldn't. They were limited to 1 or 2. And so in the downtown, we already took the leap. We said, there's no density standard in the downtown. So in the commercial central zoning district, there's no upper limit to density. We eliminated the parking requirement. And so we kind of like chipped away at these things ad hoc. And what we're trying to do with the specific area plan and some of these infill zoning projects is take all that we've learned over the last 20, 30 years implementing this code, implementing the general plan, and create new policy and zoning guidance that we determine in advance as a community. These are the values that we have as a community. These are the kinds of policies we're trying to implement with these projects. If you give us those, you're going to have a principally permitted development. We're going to get flexible with the standards because we recognize if it turns out that even though we say you could do up to 32 units per acre, you can only get 3 on your parcel, so on and so forth. So really the detail, this policy is for the Planning Commission, the City Council, and the staff to be able to work to create that additional documentation through these infill plans.
Is there any way in that case to add at the beginning of policy HE13 in the area subject to the gateway specific area plan and then refer to designated transportation providing projects? You say that it is specifically oriented toward that specific plan area. And I think it would be very helpful if that is the case to include that language in the policy.
Yeah, I'm referring to the Arcata Gateway specific area plan because that's the area that we've identified.
Right, but it's not in this language.
And we have additional infill areas that we've discussed as well that the council, the planning commission may want to take advantage of. I mean, for example, this large parcel. Here's another one. This is the Uniontown Shopping Center. Huge area, great opportunity there. We might want to develop an infill plan for this that utilizes some of the same concepts.
But
So
it will be
certainly the
subject
planning
to a
commission can-
planned development, correct? Where
No,
those
I'm talking
standards
about
will be
a
applied.
planning document. The Planning Commission can certainly make that recommendation. I mean, we could probably go back and forth all night long. You guys, you make the decision as
Can I
to what you're.
interject really quickly that it doesn't say this here, and in the new document that I've been working with our consultant on, it actually does add in that it's referenced implementation measures 11, 12, and 20, which then ties to those infill plans. So all of these goals tie to an implementation measure in one way or another. And although it's not specifically listed here because it's marked out on the next page, it ties to those three specifically, which would do, I think, what you're, because that's not how this is structured.
Yes, it
so.
would. And having struck out those implementation measures, that got rid of that limited
And that was an
characteristic.
error. They all
And
have to tie to something.
That does take care of it. Thank you.
So, yes, it is in the next.
That makes perfect sense to me now, thank you.
Pardon?
Are we going to see that, or?
I'd like to
Yeah.
see that at the point when we're going to be asked to take action.
Yeah, it's implementation measures 11, 12, and 20. So it will say
11's on
basically,
packet page 177. 12 is on 178. And 20 is on 185.
and so that language where it says reference implementation measures 11 and 12, it actually references implementation measures 11, 12, and 20. So that's the document that will be the final, so.
Okay, that actually would take care of a lot of that. There's one other issue that may be a little bit form over function, but I feel pretty strongly about. The first affordable housing measure in here is HE 14, support private and nonprofit developers.
Page 160.
It's on page 165 under Area C, affordable housing. And that was policy HE 14. Way down at the bottom in policy HE 20 is prioritize meeting the needs of low-income households. I think that it's important to put that before subsidizing our developers. And it also creates a rationale for those subsidies. So I know you're following the policy order that maybe was in the previous housing element, but it makes a lot of sense to me to move that up. Right now, it sort of feels like it's in there as an afterthought, and the subsidies for the developers come first.
We're trying to buzz in quicker. Yeah, no, I mean, if the Planning Commission wants to reorganize those, there's really no issue with that. It doesn't, these don't indicate prioritization. I think all of these policies are equally important, but certainly if you want to move things around, I don't see a problem with that.
Yeah, I was going to reiterate that there is no specific, just because you're policy 1 doesn't mean that that's more important than policy 20.
So if we're being asked to adopt a resolution, are we just making notes on changes and we'll refer to them in a motion? Is that okay? Anything else, Judith? Those are good comments.
I think I should let someone else have a chance to put their 2 cents in.
Who else would like to put 2 cents in? I have a broad question. Did HCD come back at you? It sounded like they were happy with nearly all of this. Did it feel differently this year? You've been telling us that the state's getting much more strict about their policy. They need these infill projects to happen. They need housing to happen. They need to see real starts. Did it feel different this cycle than it has in the past in terms of their responses?
So I'm going to let David answer this since he was more involved in the 2014, but what I can say is that they did want a great deal of specificity in the document, including timelines and real firm commitments. They did go back and forth, and some of the comments that we did receive were very detailed. So I in my understanding, it seemed like there was more specifics in this, but David may have more.
Yeah, I mean, really to underscore that, if you look through the implementation measures, you'll see government code listed all over the place. we've never had that before. So yeah, it's, but in terms of the, you asked about how I feel about this process. So, I just want to take the opportunity to, really, identify the hard work that HCD staff has done, to be responsive and reviewing our housing element. Robin Huntley in particular, who did the lion's share of the work at HCD, had really fast turnaround. I think she was reading our first redraft of the housing element over the weekend when we submitted it to her on Friday, and she had comments back to us on Monday. So the working relationship, in particular with staff at HCD, especially in the policy unit, has always been really good. We've developed good working relationships over the years, but Robin really went above and beyond, knocked it out of the park, getting us to the point where we could have a certified housing element, which is really critical for funding, HCD funding, for example. I also want to recognize, PlaceWorks did a good job of, turning our comments around, and they worked, to, make sure that they were being responsive to us as well. And Jen, I can't say enough about how much effort she put into this document and just tracking all the bits and pieces and the track changes, the revisions going back and forth. And, there was a lot of work that went into this document, and by a lot of different people, and I think that all of the staff, city staff, many of them contributed, to the document, and the acknowledgments are on the front page. You guys are included in there. Thank you so much. I feel like this is, it's a much more in-depth document than we've ever done before. I do anticipate, the state is still, on almost a, monthly basis, there's some new housing law coming through. In fact, I don't have it on your agenda this time, but I'll bring forward the Office of Planning and Research's policy sort of synopsis at a Planning Commission meeting near you soon. There's a lot going on right now in CEQA and housing law, and it's, there's a lot to keep track of, so it was different.
Can I additionally ask broadly, do you see this document as the backbone to an infill-specific program that we develop? Will it be an addendum? I don't quite see how this plays out.
Absolutely, yeah. The overarching umbrella, the specific infill redevelopment plan, has included in it the market study, which AED is doing for us right now. The market study is really going to lay the foundation, a technical data foundation, not a narrative and I think this is happening foundation, but we're going to be actually looking at, what are the fiscal impact analysis of doing infill development versus greenfield development? What are the market needs? That infill market study is also going to provide for us some indicators that we can track over time to see, how well are we meeting our housing goals, for the city. That infill market study was intended to be the basis for this housing element, but they're kind of running concurrently right now. In fact, the housing element got out in front of it. We've pulled some of the data in from that infill study to help develop this housing element. And the housing element, as you're aware, is, this is the sixth cycle. It's a state mandated element of the general plan that has to be updated periodically to make sure that you're accounting for your regional housing needs allocation. But we're also at the end of our 20-year cycle for the general plan. It used to be called General Plan 2020. One of the amendments that we made over the past couple of years was to remove 2020. That didn't change the fact that it was a 20-year planning document adopted in 2000. And so the next step in this umbrella plan is to adopt the environmental analysis and those fairly comprehensive update to our general plan that will tie back to, at least for housing, some of the work that we've done in these two documents. And it'll, bring us into compliance with some required updates to our general plan. I anticipate that environmental document will also lay the groundwork for the mitigation or the implementation measures that we have in this plan that include increasing density. So whether it's the rezone and upzone program or the infill program, these different implementation measures that we're talking about tonight that are new, that general plan EIR will be a master EIR for those amendments that we need to make. We've asserted that we are going to make these amendments within the first 3 years of this housing element cycle to accomplish our RENA. Right now, we've fallen short. This document does not show that we have the available land to meet our regional housing needs allocation. And so the way we're doing it is through these plans. So this is the seed document that will create those other plans, the infill plan, the specific area plan, targeted rezonings. All of those things are baked into this document and will reference back to. It's part of the reason why this policy HE13 and its related implementation measures are so important, because as part of this umbrella planning effort that we're doing, they all stitch together. The ultimate outcome of that effort being the gateway plan and those infill upzones that really changed dramatically the way that the city has done development planning in the past, and accomplish the city's goals as dictated by the state through the regional housing needs allocation process, but also put us in the driver's seat on how we do that.
Thank you.
Could I ask a question about timing? So the rezoning would need to happen within 3 years of the certification of the housing element. And that rezoning is going to be linked to the infill plan and the gateway plan and all of those other pieces. If we slow down on that rezoning, does that mean that our housing element gets decertified with all the financial ramifications of that? And is it something that HCD threatens to do, or is it something that slams on the minute we've missed a 3-year deadline?
Yeah, there are, a number of different, sort of sticks associated with this new housing element law that's been adopted. And I anticipate over the course of this next 3 years that'll continue to change, as I'd mentioned earlier, and will be subject to those new laws, even though they weren't in place when we adopted this. The housing element gets certified, but there are penalties associated with not meeting, different penalties associated with not meeting the requirements that you have. And so, for example, if you don't develop out within the timeframes that you've planned for, there are certain types of developments that become principally permitted. So we lose our local control to review those. For the rezones, we're being certified on the basis of us completing those rezone programs. If we don't complete them, they're going to be checking in. I mean, we have our reporting requirements annually. We report on what we've done. If we get to year 3 and we haven't done them, I don't want to say definitively that HCD is going to slam down the hammer day 1, but HCD is already the state's suing other jurisdictions that have basically refused to come into compliance. I don't know that they would come after us with the same vigor, but I do, there would be negative consequences for sure. So we need to to make those rezones happen within the 3-year period. It's as simple as that.
And the 610 units is a 10-year cycle, correct?
8.
8, thank you. Okay, any other questions or comments here? Then I think we need to clarify what our,
I just had a quick question.
Yeah, please,
so that
go ahead.
8-year cycle can change to 4 if we're not in compliance?
If we don't have an adopted housing element, so if...
So we have till the 29th to do that and we're good
Yes.
for 8 then?
Yes, so if the city council does not adopt it at the 18th meeting, then we're down to a 4-year.
Thank you.
so in any kind of a motion here, we need to make reference to any changes that we're interested in.
So we're just going to change the HE 14 needs to include the implementation, I can't even say it, measures 11, 12, and 20, right?
HE 13, I think.
HE 13.
It was whatever Jen
It's
said
HE
they were.
13.
Oh, it was 13. Oh, I said 14. Okay, 13.
But they wanted to change the
And then you wanna
priority
change the
of
order.
14 and 20.
Yeah.
Those aren't prioritized, though, he already said. Oh, do we still
Just
want to
the
change it, even though
sequence.
they're all a priority? You want to just change the sequence?
You know,
Why don't you make the motion?
You're our motion maker.
I can do that, but David said that those aren't prioritized in any
They-
manner.
It's just the optics.
They
Okay.
aren't, but the symbolic value of subsidies to developers before priority for low-income households is
So
important.
you wanted
Can
to,
I just interject quickly that by doing that, it makes changes to the whole rest of the document, and I'm going to have to go back to our consultant tomorrow morning to get that done before noon so that I can include that in the packet. So I'm just saying that, just to keep in mind.
Okay, so in other words, it'll make a mess. What about
Yes,
the other
potentially.
change? Will that, will
will
that
definitely
make
be more
a total
difficult,
mess
so.
as well?
I think what we can do, I mean, you know, you said earlier you felt really strongly about it. What we can do is bring forward to the council that you made a recommendation to change, to swap HE 14 with HE 20. That's what you want to do?
Sure.
And then they'll be looking at this exact same document. In fact, I think it's already loaded into our system, but they'll be looking at this same document, although I do believe that the 11, 12, and 20 are already added. Is that correct?
Yes, the 11, 12, and 20 are already added, but it is not in our system yet because I'm not going to get it till tomorrow morning because there's one last tiny piece that went.
Okay. So the recommendation of the council will essentially be to swap 14 and 20 based on the Planning Commission's action. Assuming they, you know, choose to do that, I don't see why they wouldn't. We can make the changes later on down the road, so we don't have to like shuffle this real quick. If you feel strongly about it, by all means, if you've got the support of the majority of your members, let's do it.
If that's something that's not going to kill your workload.
What you're saying is the change then would actually just get made down the road and Jennifer doesn't have to scramble
She doesn't
tomorrow.
have to do anything tomorrow to address this. Yeah, we'll address it down the road.
so it should not be included in our, or they're just going to recommend it, it's not going to be included in my motion?
That's a staff question.
Do I need to include it in the motion, or are you just going to?
You could say changes as identified by the Planning Commission. We'll know what that means.
That sounds great.
Okay, so I'm going to make a motion to adopt resolution number PC-19-08, recommending the city council adopt the draft housing element. The addition is under HE 13 to include implementation measures 11, 12, and 20, and to recommend to the city council to switch, whatever you said, HE 14 with HE 20 as a priority.
And I'm sorry, the one other amendment to Resolution PC 1908 would be to include, under the CEQA determination, both the addendum and the common sense exemption as is stated in your staff report.
As noted.
As noted.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor of passing this, please indicate by saying aye.
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 Motion carries.
No sleeping in for you tomorrow, huh?
Never.
All right. Thank you, staff. Thank you for putting this monstrous package together. And we have one more item tonight on our business. Where are we at here? Pardon me. Oh, yes, annual report. That's what I'm looking for. So under business items, we have to approve the 2019 Planning Commission annual report.
I don't have a staff report per se, just the annual report's attached. That's up to the Planning Commission to approve it, and then presumably the chair will present it to the council. You can make any changes you'd like, and we'll note those changes and then bring the amended version to the council.
So are there any changes or comments on that?
I do have one suggestion, and it's one I think I've made in the last few annual reports with regard to Planning Commission goals for 2020 on training. That's item H on page 420. When you specify that the commission would like more formal training, I think one of the things that would be really helpful, in addition to attending various meetings that we can go to for free, is to have access to several subscription-based online resources that could be useful for training, not just for the commission, but for the city council and all city staff on planning issues, and that would require a bit of money. And so this might be an appropriate time to ask the city council to allocate those funds. And I think that it's important to recognize that those training opportunities could be made available not just to the commission, but to city staff and the city council as well.
So we want a budget.
Yeah, we want a budget, and I think I've sent a number of resource requests that seem to meet with the same response year after year. And this time, perhaps, if there were some money allocated, then we would all benefit.
So I had you in mind when I was writing this, and so I may not have gone far enough. So let me suggest the second sentence, or that a second sentence be added that reads something to the effect of training and subscription resources, electronic or otherwise, will need to be budgeted to accomplish this goal.
I love it.
And then would this look like webinars or something that we could all independently do online? Is that what we're thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I've suggested a number of things, and I think that staff has suggested a number of things. One of the resources would be a subscription to the training resources from Planetizen, which is operated by the American Planning Association. It has these great online training courses, dozens and dozens and dozens of them that we could pick and choose from. Another one would be something as simple as a subscription to the California Planning and Development report, which comes out weekly. It's pricey to subscribe to as individuals, but it's certainly something that city staff and the council might benefit from as well, all of those things. So I'm sure we can think of more of them, but they all would require a few $100s from the council to accomplish.
Other ideas that we've considered is perhaps working with other jurisdictions and their boards to host a training where we would bring some trainers up, kind of host a mini symposium for Humboldt County, because even though those are pretty costly, it's a lot more cost effective than trying to send each of you down to a training. And I think that we don't have the same resources readily available as metropolitans do, and so I think this has been certainly on the docket for a number of years. I know Commissioner Mayer's brought it up a number of times, and it is every budget year is tight. And so generally, the training budget is one of the first to get cut, but I think that now is a good time to remind the City Council, your your report will be going to the city council in January, and that'll really be sort of the beginning of the budget planning year for fiscal year 2021. So now's a perfect time to make that ask.
Great. So do you need a motion and approval on this?
Yes, please.
Okay. If there's no further discussion.
I'll move to approve the annual report of the Planning Commission and ask Chair Tangney to make that report to the City Council.
I would be happy to. Do we have a second?
Second.
A second? Okay, motion, all in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
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 Motion carries. And now we're on to correspondence and communications. I have one question. Is there an update on what's going on at Craftsman's Mall that's brief, super brief? I haven't heard anything about it in such a long time after it.
I
breaking
don't have-
records for the number of meetings and everything else.
Yeah, I don't have an update.
Okay.
Yeah, there's nothing new.
Okay. Any other correspondence and communications from anybody? No? Okay. Yes.
Yeah, we do have just a quick one. Deela's gonna.
Yes, so I did a little bit of research last time we talked about updates to state law regarding accessory dwelling units. And I said, we'll have to do research and get back to you. So we did it. I made copies of some of the assembly bills to pass out. So the two assembly bills that made the most significant changes to ADU law are AB 68 and AB 881. I wouldn't worry about reviewing these in detail right now. Just take them home and look at them if you feel like it. But basically, starting January 1st, 2020, there are going to be some changes to ADU law that will affect both single-family and multifamily residential zones. State law will be changed to basically principally permit 4 different accessory dwelling unit and junior accessory dwelling unit configurations. 2 are more related to single-family lots, and 2 relate to multifamily lots, which is new and different. So, Government Code Section 65852.2 that currently houses accessory dwelling unit regulations. It's being amended to read, a local agency shall ministerially approve an application for a building permit within a residential or mixed-use zone to create any of the following, and then gives 4 types. And I'm just going to read these off really quickly, but slowly. Measured, but slow, so that you can understand. Okay, the first is 1 accessory dwelling unit and 1 junior accessory dwelling unit per lot. So that would be a total of 3 units principally permitted on a single-family zone district lot. The second is 1 detached new construction accessory dwelling unit with a proposed or existing single-family dwelling. That's the second one. The third is multiple accessory dwelling units within the portions of existing multifamily dwelling structures that are not used as livable space, so increasing density within existing multifamily dwellings. And then the fourth is no more than 2 accessory dwelling units located on a lot with an existing multifamily dwelling, but are detached from that multifamily dwelling. So that'd be adding 2 more detached units in the back of an existing multifamily dwelling unit. And these are all things that local agencies in California will now be required to ministerially approve. So that's what the legislation in front of you changed. And what I gave you was the bill summaries. They're available on the California Legislative Info website. It gives you kind of a summary and then comments from the legislator that authored the bill, and then some kind of pros and cons, arguments in support and in opposition. So just an interesting read. Might put you to sleep, might not.
How soon will we see those changes hit the Arcata Planning Department?
Well, it's required to be implemented January 1st, 2020. So if somebody comes in January 1st with a site plan, we'll have to ministerially approve it within a certain number of days. I believe it's 60 days.
So
I think the important thing is that it's not going to hit the planning commission. It's going to go to the building counter.
does that override the impervious surface 50% max rule?
I'm going to have to get back to you on that. I believe that they're required to meet all standards. I do want to take note that, you know, these are intended to be brief communications, and we can certainly program this for a more robust staff report under business items at the next council meeting, and we'll make sure to address that. But I believe that you have to meet the zoning requirements.
There's going to be a lot of really interesting questions that will come up. So yeah, please stay tuned for more. And I think David wanted to maybe briefly talk about third units potentially being permitted in different zones throughout town, or do you want to save that for a different correspondence? Okay, we're saving it. That's all.
What you read, is that in what you just handed out? The four different...
Actually, the specific section, I did not. So I actually have my own little government code section. So if you want, I can read off the government code section for you, and you can... Okay, we're bringing it back.
Okay, perfect. All right. Is that it?
That's it from me. Yes, thank you.
That's it from us, too. So we are adjourned. Thank you.